Okay, so I just caught my breath. I jogged down the street to upload the video because why the fuck not? Everybody's up right now anyway, and I just had some coffee. I'll try to condense as much as possible. So I left off on sociocracy. Recently I came across the term, and from what I understand, the caveat that I was referring to was that it's like anarchy in the sense that there is no acknowledged, established and permanent, monolithic structure of government. And so what it views government as is a social tool, like a social contract that you can engage in or not engage in at your discretion. And in some situations, some circumstances, certain types of government or of management or organization hierarchies or lack of hierarchies are necessary or more functional. You might be in a situation where an autocratic, authoritarian mode of government or conduct is more efficient. Something like a CEO of a company or something like that. In that case, if it's the most efficient way to manage, the resources or, delegate labor or tasks, then you engage in that form of government willingly. But as soon as it becomes obsolete or no longer necessary in other ways, then you dismantle that form of government. And so that leads me to the dismantling of civilization. Given climate change, which I believe in, but I believe I might have mentioned it, but in case I haven't, I believe that man-made climate change is wrong, and I believe that natural climate change itself is wrong, and I believe together they are right. I believe there is two factors: natural cyclical, climatic changes, primarily, solar activity and other things. We are seeing climate change in other planets in the solar system currently. And I believe that those are not just simple correlations. I believe that there's a causative factor that is leading to the climate change on all those planets, and Earth included. But I believe that for all intents and purposes, it's safe to call it man-made, climate change or global warming. But climate change is more accurate, considering that it may bring on an ice age after the heating period. What has happened is it's a thermodynamic system which needs to balance itself out, and therefore the energy will be placed into something else, such as chemical bonds or, phase changes in matter in order to store that potential energy. It needs to regain some sort of stability. We have destabilized the natural systems. So, yes, this dismantling of civilization idea, concept. I believe that there's some merit to this. I've listened to a couple lectures by a man named Derek Jensen, and you can look them up, or an organization called Deep Green Resistance. And they argue that humanity is destructing the natural systems of the world and, enslaving or, exploiting the indigenous peoples and, killing nature. And in order for humanity to survive, because the planet will recover on its own, I believe, even if it has different life forms on it, or different, order of things, different climate, whatever, life will continue, even if it's stunted. It will recover. What he argues is that civilization has to be deconstructed. It has to be willfully taken apart, either voluntarily or by force, or it will lead to its own self-destruction. Right, so on better systems, let's start with, I used to be heavily into the physical sciences. I used to be into the quote-unquote hard sciences. I used to think of the world as a system, and, as an engineer, people teach people like me, the public, these systems, they have ways of breaking, and there's ways to fix it. There's, like, you just change out the cog and you fix the way the rest of the, gears work. And so I believed heavily in the progress of science, and I became interested in, biology. I wanted to major in biology. I'll go back to that in a minute. I liked genetics because currently we're going through a period of very much progress in genetics and biotechnology, and the city that I lived in, was a hub for biotechnology in the United States. It was, one of the most important places for biotechnology. And so I viewed things as, there's a fix, there's a way, there has to be another set of systems that we can, work with, like tools. If the government doesn't work, then we'll swap it out for another one. And I went through the gamut of different types of governments, and I came across the work of a man named, I believe he was a mathematician primarily, a man named Buckminster Fuller, affectionately dubbed Bucky Fuller. They named buckyballs the fullerene molecule structure after Buckminster Fuller. It's a nanostructure, and he is the inventor of the geodesic dome. You're probably familiar with that. Another person that I mentioned that I respect is Jamie Mansell. He constructed a geodesic dome in Vermont. Domes plural. And he also had a lot of views about society. With the traumatic death of his daughter, he believed that he could try to find the solutions to the world and the way things work, and he saw that the military-industrial complex could be deconstructed and applied towards good. Not literally, but practically overnight. You could change the world, solve much of the world's problems, poverty, disease, lack of education, lack of resources, all these things with simple design changes. And he came out with a lot of patents, and one of his quotes was, "We need to do away with the absolutely specious notion that man or one must make a living." Something, I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of we live in a time where the ideas of, or basically that the innovation of a single mind can sustain or benefit thousands or the entire rest of the human population, and therefore we should go back to school and study what it is that we wanted to do before someone came along and told us that we had to make a living, make money off of things. Basically saying, you're teaching people how to be workers, not thinkers. And so I really liked his ideas, and unfortunately he's been dead for about his time was around 100 years or more ago, and we still haven't done away with the military-industrial complex. In fact, it's enveloped the world. The military-industrial complex runs geopolitics across the globe. And, good, I still have some time. And, and so it's really disheartening that such a good person, such a good soul, could be let down by humanity like that, when he really wanted our best interest, and he devoted his life, like many others, to try to solve the problems of the world. And so I went through a phase of, like, documentaries, and some documentaries that aren't related, but I'll mention because I recommend them, are America, Freedom to Fascism. I recommend that if you're in the United States, or you're interested in the finances or politics of the United States. That's by Aaron Rousseau, I think. His last name's Rousseau for sure. And I watch a lot of permaculture documentaries too, with Jeff Lawton. Greening the Desert is really, really interesting. There's sequels or follows up, because the project was dismantled due to lack of funding, but the results are still in place, and they're showing fruit, so to speak, and maybe literally. And what else? The book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Geez, I've forgotten so much. You get rusty when you don't exercise your brain, It's true. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? So, what else? The Corporation is one of them. More recently, Food Inc. was all right. And notably Zeitgeist. All three of them were good for their own reasons. They all had, different bits of information, but it's a little much to sit through and watch all three of them. So I don't recommend watching all three of them at once. Space it out, but they all do have their merit, and they get better in the form of presentation, but they're all just as good with content. And the parallel I want to draw between Buckminster Fuller and one of the people mentioned in those documentaries, Jacques Fresco, was also he was an engineer, or I believe, or a self-taught polymath at least, and his Venus Project and the Zeitgeist movement are worth mentioning, because they propose a resource-based economy. Right, and that leads me to my interest in epigenetics. I'm currently reading a book on epigenetics. I didn't know who the founder, the acknowledged founder of epigenetics was, Wallach. Epigenetics is the study of, the effects on the organism by means of other than genetics, outside of genetics, or upon genetics, above genetics. I think it's the literal translation. That ties in with my interest in genetics, because I used to believe, the genetic model of heredity, I believe is this term, And I believed when pop science articles and a lot of other things referred to inheritable diseases, and genetic defects that were inborn and all those other things. But epigenetics, at least from Wallach's perspective, a lot of those things are environmental and primarily mineral based. And I personally have a pet theory that we would do much more for society, for humanity, if we were to apply genetic engineering to mineral accumulation, so that we could supply these minerals by means of genetically engineered organisms, be they fungus or bacteria, to accumulate minerals that are scarce in nature or becoming depleted. Zinc in topsoil, phosphorus, copper. A lot of these minerals are becoming depleted in the topsoil as the topsoil becomes depleted itself, and I believe that we could engineer these organisms to favor humanity, because without them, I believe the standard of living will decrease immensely, and that's something that Wallach mentioned, and that I believed before, and I'm glad that someone of such an importance actually, has introduced it into the mainstream. I also believe that mineral accumulation thing can be applied to mining as a sort of stable, energetically viable mining. I believe that the self-replication of biological organisms produces an exponential return, whereas with traditional mining methods, you have to input a lot of fossil fuels, and you don't see a lot of those in our future. Right, so genetics, biology, evolution. Evolution, I've been interested in since about elementary school, when I first found out about what DNA was, and I was interested in all sorts of insects, primarily praying mantises, all sorts of plants, primarily carnivorous plants. I like their evolutionary history. I was really fascinated that a mineral deficiency would lead to carnivorousness or carnivory, whichever is the proper term. And around middle school, I was able to get my hands on a copy of On the Origin of Species. I never read it fully, and the way it was written was a little hard to digest for a middle schooler, in my personal opinion. But I did, grasp the concept, and I felt like it was too formal. Later on, I found Voyage of the Beagle, which I believed, would help me understand the foundation for On the Origin of Species, and it really did. For me, it was as if I was reading, the raw material that would contribute, the observations that would contribute to his later more deliberate work. And so it was really, really interesting, Voyage of the Beagle. I recommend that too. In elementary school, I liked this video game and set of books called Myst, M-Y-S-T. And I liked that the character, was more or less a polymath, versed in geology and biology and botany, and I aspired to absorb these various subjects in order to apply them in much the same fashion to craft my own little corner of the world, much like I liked Henry David Thoreau. I wanted to just go off and live in the woods with build my own cabin and make a living for myself. Right, I believe I've covered those. Right, so So like I said, I was interested in genetics, and early on, I was raised Catholic, as you can see behind me. I'm glad I'm not Catholic myself. I believe it's an indoctrinated form of. Unfortunately, I don't want to speak ill of religion. I was religious. I believed in God, and I prayed a lot. But I saw that my prayers went unanswered, and the world still suffered. I felt a lot of guilt that as much as I prayed for the world suffering and hunger to end, it didn't, and therefore I felt the guilt. I felt responsible. I felt like I should never leave a crumb on my plate. I shouldn't waste food. I shouldn't take the things that I have for granted. It was right in this household that I began those beliefs, and that religious guilt was really crippling, and I don't think it was the best way to go. I could have reached those. I could have reached a sense of humility and responsibility and consciousness, self-awareness, or conscientiousness without having that crippling guilt. But anyway, speaking of religion, and genetics, I came upon the works of Dawkins after Darwin, through Mendel, because of a book called The Selfish Gene. And the selfish gene, specifically, one of the theories that I liked in there was of his primordial replicators, these inorganic or maybe hybrid organic and inorganic molecules, which were the first transcribers or formulators of the particle of heredity, even before DNA, possibly before RNA. That led me to find out about the Miller-Urey experiment. The Miller-Urey experiment, which in laboratory conditions created amino acids in a broth solution out of what is believed to be a replication of primordial atmospheric gases and an electric spark. With the Miller-Urey experiment, I came across another hypothesis called the sweet crystal hypothesis. The sweet crystal hypothesis posits that perhaps silica or other minerals, inorganic minerals in the regolith of early Earth, possibly clay, and silica within clay formed the backbone of early predecessors to RNA and DNA. So like I said, this video and the one before this, the part 1, are for things that I would like to pass on as ways of trying to introduce myself. These are things that form my worldview. Right, and then later on, after I'd gotten into Dawkins, he came out with a book called The God Delusion, and I was a little aggressive, and a lot of people started not liking Dawkins for his work in, trying to dispel the myths of religion. And I don't think his approach was the most societally tactful. If anything, it's a little arrogant, but I respect his intent because of the suffering that organized religion, has caused the world. But I believe if it wasn't one ideology, it'd be another. It's just easy for religion to do so because it asks for blind faith, and those who, seek power are able to abuse that faith. So, right. I I became interested in biotechnology and technology in general, um, and I came across the works of Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is a known transhumanist, proponent of the technological singularity, um, and he authored a book that I really liked in high school, called "The Singularity is Near." I became convinced that the technological singularity would be, the starting point of a new golden age. But he also mentions, three revolutions: the genetic, biotechnology revolution, the robotics revolution, and the nanotechnology revolution. The nanotechnology revolution was what led me to the works of Kurzweil, because I had read Engines of Creation by, I believe his name is Drexler, and Drexler really sells nanotechnology, but I've come to believe that natural biological systems, primarily at the microscopic, biochemical level, are living examples of biotech or nanotechnology. We just call it life, but I believe it's nanotechnology in functioning, stable form. And so, anyway, it led me to Ray Kurzweil and, his book, the Singularity is Near, technological singularity. The idea crossed with my, beginning like freshman year of high school. I became really interested in physics, and I was reading a lot of, theoretical physics. Brian Greene introduced me to string theory, superstring theory, and Michio Kaku, parallel worlds, was maybe a little less technical, but just as informative. And so yeah, so going into this introduction to technological singularity, one of the things that he mentions is that biotechnology will extend the lifespan and living quality of people, in order to, even some baby boomers may be able to make it to the technological singularity and therefore potentially live almost forever. The living forever thing crossed paths with my study into immortality and the works of Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey de Grey, who authored Ending Aging, and I also read Kurzweil's and Terry Grossman's book, which I'm pissed that it's not in Spanish. There's no Spanish, publication, and I really wanted my parents to read it, because it's